The millionaire's daughter is traveling home for Thanksgiving and stops at a roadside café for lunch. She gets paralyzed upon seeing a waitress identical to her, wearing a pendant. The same one her father gave her deceased sister 25 years ago. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Olivia Hart was a woman defined by precision and purpose. At 32, she had already carved out a formidable career as an executive in her father's real estate empire, Hart & Company. Known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense demeanor, Olivia had built her reputation on quick decisions and unyielding standards. Her colleagues described her as fiercely driven, a professional who thrived on high stakes and delivered results with clockwork efficiency. Yet, beneath that veneer of control lay a restlessness, an ache that not even her many professional accolades could soothe. Her lifestyle mirrored her work ethic. She resided in a modern penthouse in the heart of the city, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. Mornings began with power smoothies and emails, while evenings were reserved for late-night strategy calls. Weekends, when not claimed by networking events or charity galas, were spent alone with a glass of wine and a view of the bustling streets below. It was a life polished to perfection but devoid of the warmth that most people sought. Despite her success, Olivia was a woman shaped by loss. The death of her younger sister, Jennifer, had defined her early years and left a shadow that her family rarely spoke of. While Olivia's father, Richard, had buried himself in building his business and acquiring wealth, her mother had become increasingly distant before passing away from a sudden illness a decade later. Olivia was left to pick up the pieces in silence, developing a resilience that would come to characterize her entire adult life. Richard's relentless pursuit of success had set the standard in their household. Emotions were luxuries, distractions best kept at bay. Olivia learned to echo his priorities, excelling at everything she touched, from academics to leadership roles. But her successes were always tempered by a feeling that she was moving through life with armor too thick to let anything truly touch her heart. That lingering ache made moments of genuine connection rare, leaving her with relationships that were either professional or perfunctory. Her few attempts at meaningful friendships often faltered, with work taking precedence over personal bonds. Olivia's love life was a string of relationships that fizzled out as soon as potential partners realized her heart was kept under lock and key. If asked, she would smile and say she simply hadn't found the right person. But the truth was simpler: letting people in felt like a risk she wasn't ready to take. When it came to family, Thanksgiving was the one time of year where Olivia adhered to tradition, albeit with a hint of reluctance. Richard held an annual Thanksgiving gathering at their estate, a day that was equal parts warm hospitality and thinly veiled formality. Old friends of the family and business associates attended, raising glasses in the cavernous dining room, where laughter often felt rehearsed. For Olivia, the holiday was a performance, an obligation wrapped in layers of nostalgia and expectation. Despite the charade, there was something about the holiday season that stirred an unsettling mix of emotions. The sight of the grand staircase draped in garlands, the sound of silverware clinking against fine china, and the faint scent of pine in the air had a way of unearthing memories she'd long since buried. Thanksgiving was when she felt Jennifer's absence most keenly, a silent reminder of what could have been. Yet, Olivia attended each year, playing her role with the precision expected of her. Richard, now in his late 60s, had mellowed with age, but the cracks in his polished exterior hinted at deep-seated guilt. Olivia sensed it, though it was never spoken aloud. Their conversations were civil but lacked the comfort and ease that might have bridged their shared loss. Still, the idea of family held a complicated allure, a blend of obligation, resentment, and the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, the past could be mended. This year, something felt different. A gnawing curiosity about reconnecting with something more authentic had taken hold of her, nudging her out of her strict routine. Perhaps it was the approach of another milestone birthday or the whispers of loneliness she tried to silence at the end of each workday. Whatever the reason, Olivia found herself compelled to take the trip home in her own time, without the usual flight or chauffeur arrangements. There was something she needed, though she couldn't yet name it, only that it felt important enough to warrant a departure from her meticulously controlled world. The sleepy town Olivia found herself driving through felt like a page from a forgotten storybook. It was the kind of place where time seemed to pause, and the world slowed to the comforting rhythm of small-town life. Cobblestone sidewalks, antique street lamps, and window displays lined with handmade crafts welcomed her as she navigated the narrow main street. Her gaze fell on a café tucked between a bookstore and a general store. Willow's Corner, read the sign in weathered script, its wooden boards painted in warm greens and browns. With a sigh, Olivia turned into the gravel parking lot. The chill of autumn air met her as she stepped out of her car, prompting her to pull her wool coat tighter around her. A bell above the café's door chimed as she entered, and the room enveloped her in warmth and the aroma of cinnamon, fresh coffee, and baking pies. A sudden pang of nostalgia tugged at her, drawing memories of family kitchens and childhood giggles that seemed a lifetime away. The café was cozy, almost an extension of someone's living room, with its mismatched furniture, crocheted blankets draped over chairs, and shelves lined with books and potted plants. Olivia scanned the room, catching snippets of conversation and quiet laughter. Then her eyes froze on a figure behind the counter, and everything else melted away. The waitress was young, probably in her late 20s, with auburn hair tied in a loose ponytail that cascaded over one shoulder. Her face, so familiar that Olivia felt the air rush from her lungs, was a near-perfect reflection of Jennifer's. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the way she tilted her head when she spoke and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. It was as if the universe had opened a window to a past that Olivia had long believed sealed shut. But what truly anchored her in place was the silver pendant resting against the woman's collarbone. Its delicate, swirling design mirrored the one Jennifer had worn, a gift from their father that Jennifer had cherished, and that had been presumed lost in the aftermath of the accident. Olivia's heart thudded in her chest, a wild, insistent rhythm that made her fingers tremble. "Hi there, welcome in." The waitress's voice was warm, with a slight lilt that hinted at familiarity and comfort. She looked up, her hazel eyes meeting Olivia's, and for a moment, recognition flickered, then faded as quickly as it had come. "Can I get you something to drink? We've got the best apple cider around." Olivia struggled for words, her throat tightening as she blinked away the rush of emotion. "Coffee. Black, please," she managed, her voice sounding far away, even to her. The waitress's eyes lingered, as though sensing something unsaid, before she nodded and turned to prepare the drink. Olivia watched, her mind racing. Every movement, every gesture brought her back to afternoons spent in the garden, Jennifer's laughter ringing out as they played their childhood games. The memories felt so vivid that it was almost as if Jennifer stood before her again, only older, alive. As the waitress returned with the steaming mug, Olivia finally found her voice, albeit haltingly. "I'm sorry, but you remind me of someone," she said, the understatement pressing heavy between them. The young woman smiled, a dimple appearing in her left cheek. "Funny how that happens. I've been told I have one of those faces." Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. "Your name?" "What's your name?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Grace." "Grace Turner," the waitress replied, brows knitting with slight confusion at Olivia's intensity. "Is everything all right?" "Grace," Olivia repeated, tasting the name as if trying to find a hidden meaning within its syllables. The moment felt suspended, thick with the weight of an unspoken truth. She forced a smile that barely touched her eyes. "Yes, everything's fine. Thank you for the coffee, Grace." Grace's puzzled expression softened into a kind smile. "You're welcome. Let me know if you need anything else." Olivia sat down at a corner table, her hand still shaking as she cradled the warm mug. She glanced over at Grace, who was now chatting with another customer, her laughter ringing out like a song Olivia hadn't heard in decades. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. The mystery of Grace and the past she hinted at was no coincidence. It was as if fate had brought Olivia here, urging her to unravel the tangled threads of a story that had never truly ended. Olivia sat at the corner table, her eyes flickering to the counter where Grace worked with easy efficiency. The noise of the café receded into a low hum as Olivia's mind raced. She needed answers, but couldn't come barreling in with questions that would raise alarm. She took a deep breath and decided to approach with caution. "Excuse me, Grace," Olivia called out as Grace passed by with a tray of pastries. "Do you have a moment?" The question was light, almost casual, though Olivia's heartbeat drummed insistently in her chest. Grace's eyes lit up with a friendly curiosity. "Of course," she replied, setting the tray down on an adjacent table and wiping her hands on her apron. "Is everything okay with your coffee?" Olivia smiled, the kind of smile that masked a million unspoken words. "It's perfect. I just thought I'd say hello since I'm new in town, and it seems you know everyone here." The truth slipped between the lines, concealed but pressing. Grace chuckled, an easy, melodic sound that made Olivia's breath catch. "Yeah, you could say that. This place is like a second home for a lot of folks, myself included. I grew up around here." "Grew up here?" Olivia echoed, leaning in slightly, her fingers wrapping tighter around the ceramic mug. "But you said you were at an orphanage?" The question was phrased softly, as if merely filling a pause in the conversation, but it was far from casual. Grace nodded, a wistful smile touching her lips. "Yes, the Willow Creek Orphanage. It's just a few miles outside of town. I don't remember much before I got there. It's strange, growing up surrounded by other kids who are all piecing together their own stories. You learn not to ask too many questions." Olivia's eyes darted to the pendant again. "And that necklace?" she ventured, keeping her tone light, though her heart was hammering. Grace's hand instinctively went to the pendant, her thumb brushing over its familiar pattern. "This? It's funny, really. I don't know much about it. There was this kind woman who used to visit the orphanage when I was little. She'd bring books and treats, but she never stayed long. Before she stopped coming altogether, she gave this to me and said it was special, that I should keep it close." She laughed softly, though there was a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "I always wondered who she was, but no one seemed to know." A shiver ran down Olivia's spine. The story felt like an echo of a long-forgotten chapter from her own life. The pendant, the mysterious visitor, it was too coincidental to ignore. She willed herself to stay calm, to think clearly. "That must have been hard, not knowing," Olivia said, her voice softening in empathy. Grace's expression shifted to something more thoughtful. "It was, but I had the community. Mrs. Lacey, the director of the orphanage, was like a mother to all of us. And then, working here, it's funny how life finds ways to give you a place to belong, even if it's not the one you imagined." The weight of the conversation sat between them, heavy and humming with untold stories. Olivia's gaze lingered on Grace, the likeness to Jennifer striking her anew with every glance. It was uncanny, not just in appearance but in small, almost imperceptible quirks, the tilt of her head when she listened, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. "So you stayed in town after you grew up?" Olivia asked, hoping to keep the conversation flowing, to learn more without prying too obviously. Grace nodded, shifting her weight slightly as a new customer walked in. "Yeah, I never felt the urge to leave. This town is home. I have good friends here, and I get to meet interesting people every day," she said, giving Olivia a knowing look that carried a hint of teasing. "Like you." Olivia's practiced composure slipped just enough to let out a small laugh, the sound surprising even her. I suppose I am an unusual sight around here, she admitted, though her mind was still turning over every detail, dissecting the pieces that didn't add up, those that did. The bell above the cafe door chimed again, and Grace glanced over before sighing lightly. Duty calls, she said, nodding toward a small group waiting to be seated. But don't be a stranger, Olivia. I'd like to hear more about this person I remind you of, someday. A rush of emotions knotted in Olivia's chest. I'd like that, she replied, the words tasting bittersweet as she watched Grace move away to greet the new customers. Alone again at her table, Olivia let her eyes drop to the coffee, now lukewarm and untouched. She could feel the weight of questions pressing against her temples, urging her to dive deeper, to search for clues she wasn't sure she was ready to find. The image of the pendant glinting around Grace's neck replayed in her mind, a silent dare to look beyond the surface and risk unearthing the truth. Grace's laughter floated across the room, mingling with the clatter of cups and the low hum of conversation. Olivia couldn't help but wonder, was she grasping at shadows, or had fate truly led her here for a reason? The late afternoon sun was already casting long shadows across the road as Olivia pulled out of the cafe parking lot. She gripped the steering wheel, replaying the conversation with Grace in her mind. The resemblance, the pendant, the details of her past, there were too many coincidences to ignore. Every instinct told her that this was more than a chance encounter. Yet, part of her whispered that she might be chasing ghosts, holding on to hope where there was none. By the time Olivia reached the winding drive that led to the Hart estate, the sky had deepened to a dusky blue. The house, a sprawling structure of old stone and ivy-covered walls, stood proudly against the horizon, its windows glowing warmly. The scent of burning logs from the fireplaces mingled with the crisp air, and a hint of roasted turkey and spiced cider wafted through the entrance as she stepped inside. "Olivia, there you are," called Aunt Clara, who was always the first to spot her. With her bright red lipstick and oversized cardigan patterned with dancing turkeys, she was hard to miss. Clara enveloped Olivia in a hug that smelled of cinnamon and strong perfume, pulling back to study her niece's face. "You look tired, dear. The city life still taking its toll?" she asked, patting Olivia's cheek in her usual dramatic fashion. Olivia managed a smile. "I'm fine, Aunt Clara. Just a long drive. Come help me with the cranberry sauce," a voice called from the kitchen. It was her cousin Sam, apron askew and hair tousled as always. He was the family's self-appointed chef, who liked to experiment with dishes to varying degrees of success. "Sam's already burned the first batch," Clara whispered conspiratorially, making Olivia's smile widen. The house was buzzing with the usual pre-Thanksgiving energy, the sound of pots clanging, snippets of conversation overlapping, and the faint strains of holiday music playing from an old record player. It was chaotic but familiar, comforting in a way Olivia rarely admitted. She moved through the rooms, exchanging quick greetings with relatives who ranged from genuinely happy to see her to those who only paused long enough to ask about her career before moving on. There was Uncle Ray, who always cornered her with stories that went nowhere, and Aunt Betty, who commented loudly about Olivia's single status with thinly veiled disapproval. But the noise, the laughter, even the exasperating chatter, all reminded her why she still came back, despite everything. "Olivia." Her father's voice, cut through the din, deep and commanding as always. Richard Hart stood by the fireplace, dressed in a tailored sweater that did nothing to soften his steely demeanor. The lines on his face were sharper now, age lending him a sternness that was offset only by the briefest hint of a smile reserved for his daughter. He approached and kissed her on the cheek. "Glad to have you home." "It's good to be back," Olivia said, and for a moment, she meant it. The distance between them was palpable but familiar, a dance they both knew well. After hours of bustling preparations and narrowly avoiding Sam's second attempt at cranberry sauce, dinner was served. The long mahogany table was adorned with heirloom candlesticks and an impressive floral centerpiece. Plates passed hands, stories were swapped, and laughter rippled around the room. Olivia found herself caught between feeling part of it all and standing on the outside, watching a performance she knew by heart. When the main courses were cleared and dessert plates brought out, the conversation took on a more relaxed air. It was then, as she sipped her wine, that Olivia decided to break the silence that had been gnawing at her. "I had the strangest experience on the way here," she said, glancing around the table. The noise quieted as relatives leaned in, eager for a story. "I stopped at a café in a little town off the main road. There was a waitress there who looked exactly like Jennifer." The words left her mouth carefully, deliberately. "She even had that old pendant. The one Jennifer used to wear." A hush settled over the room, broken only by the sound of Sam's fork clattering onto his plate. Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Olivia. "Olivia, you know how memories can play tricks. Let's not dwell on the past tonight," he said, his voice measured but laced with a warning. "But, Dad, she mentioned being adopted and not knowing her background." "It was uncanny," Olivia pressed, feeling the charged energy shift across the table. Aunt Clara's brows knitted together as she whispered, "What do you mean, the same pendant?" Sam glanced from Olivia to Richard, the curiosity in his eyes quickly fading to discomfort when he caught his uncle's expression. Richard's response was swift. "Enough," he said, louder this time, drawing every gaze to him. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's the holidays, Olivia. Let's keep it light." The room buzzed with unspoken questions as Richard took a deliberate sip of his drink, signaling the end of the conversation. The chatter soon resumed, albeit more subdued, with sideways glances exchanged across the table. Olivia's stomach churned as she met her father's eyes one last time. There was something there, a flicker of recognition, of unease, before he looked away. As the dinner wore on, Olivia's mind kept returning to the café, to Grace's smile, to the way her father had shut down the conversation with a finality that bordered on desperation. Whatever secrets were hidden in the past, they were closer to the surface than she had ever imagined. The house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, the hum of conversation giving way to the creak of footsteps on the staircase and the soft closing of bedroom doors. Olivia lay on her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling as the shadows of tree branches outside swayed in the moonlight. Sleep felt impossible. Her mind replayed the dinner, her father's abrupt dismissal, and the murmur of confused relatives still swirling like echoes in her ears. She sat up, glancing at the clock on the nightstand. It was nearly midnight. A memory surfaced, unbidden. When she was a little girl, she and Jennifer would tiptoe into the attic during storms, giggling as they unearthed old photographs and forgotten trinkets under the dim glow of a single bulb. The attic had always been a treasure trove of secrets and stories, a place where the past felt tangible. Olivia's breath caught as the realization struck her, that same attic might hold the answers she was so desperate to find. The house was quiet now, a peaceful silence blanketing the rooms as the last light in the hallway flickered off. Careful not to make a sound, Olivia slipped out of bed, pulling a robe tightly around her shoulders. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and she winced, pausing to listen for any signs of movement. Satisfied that the house remained asleep, she made her way to the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The wooden door resisted at first, but with a gentle nudge, it gave way, releasing a puff of cool, musty air. Olivia flicked on the old pull-chain light, its weak glow casting deep shadows across the room. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam as she moved deeper into the attic, eyes scanning the stacks of boxes, trunks, and loose piles of books. Everything smelled of age, a blend of faded paper and wood. She found the family albums on a shelf near a stack of holiday decorations. The covers were cracked, their edges worn from years of handling. Olivia reached for one and settled onto an old trunk, the hinges creaking beneath her. Page after page showed the familiar timeline of their family, Richard's wedding to her mother, holidays where Jennifer's blonde curls caught the sunlight, birthdays with brightly colored cakes. Olivia's throat tightened as she traced a photo of her and Jennifer playing in the garden, their laughter frozen in time. The album shifted, and a small envelope slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Olivia's brow furrowed as she picked it up, noting her father's unmistakable handwriting scrawled across the front, "Private." Her heart thudded as she opened it, revealing an old photograph inside. The image was worn, the colors faded, but it was clear enough. There was Richard, younger, standing beside a woman Olivia didn't recognize. She was striking, with auburn hair that caught the light and eyes so familiar it made Olivia's breath catch. It was Grace's face, staring back at her through the years. A chill swept over Olivia, prickling her skin. The woman was holding a young child, barely a toddler, bundled in a blanket. Questions surged up, tangled and insistent. Who was this woman? And why did her father keep this hidden? She flipped the photo over, hoping for a clue, and saw a single line scribbled in faded ink, "Summer, 1998. That year. The year Jennifer disappeared. Her hands trembled as she set the photograph down, eyes scanning the attic for anything else that might explain what she was seeing. An old shoebox near the back wall caught her attention, its lid partially ajar. She tugged it toward her, sneezing as a cloud of dust rose. Inside, she found a collection of letters, their pages thin and yellowed with age. Each was addressed in the same feminine handwriting, all to Richard. Olivia's heart twisted as she read the first line of a letter dated just weeks after Jennifer's disappearance. "Richard, I can't keep this secret any longer." The rest of the letter detailed cryptic plans and apologies, references to a choice that had haunted its author. There were hints of a child and arrangements, but never a full explanation. Olivia sifted through the letters, piecing together fragments of a story that painted a picture she wasn't prepared for. The mysterious woman in the photograph wasn't just a passing acquaintance, she was part of their lives, part of whatever happened that fateful summer. She sat back, pressing a hand to her chest as if to steady the wild thumping of her heart. The attic felt smaller now, the air colder. Questions thudded in her mind like footsteps on a staircase. Was Grace the child in the photograph? Had her father known all along that Jennifer might have survived? The weight of the realization left her breathless. The light from the attic's lone bulb flickered, casting moving shadows that seemed to echo the tremor in her hands. Olivia's gaze fell back to the photograph, the mysterious woman's eyes locked with hers as though daring her to pursue the truth. The next morning, the house hummed with an energy that matched the crisp, clear sky outside. Relatives bustled in with arms full of pies, casseroles, and enough warm chatter to fill the rooms. The scent of rosemary and garlic mingled with the cinnamon undertones of baked goods, weaving a comforting backdrop to the day's chaos. Olivia moved through the kitchen, helping set platters and passing drinks, all the while casting furtive glances at her father. Richard stood in the corner, discussing an investment portfolio with Uncle Ray, his expression composed and practiced. Olivia's mind churned with the secrets she'd unearthed in the attic, the image of the woman with Grace's face etched into her thoughts. But each time she tried to catch Richard's eye, another relative would appear, demanding attention or sharing a story punctuated by loud laughter. Time ticked by, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. The air felt thicker with every passing hour. "Olivia, can you help with the table settings?" Sam called, waving a handful of cutlery. She forced a smile and joined him, her mind only half present as she arranged the polished silverware in neat rows. "Is everything okay?" "You seem somewhere else," Sam said, his tone light but curious. "I'm fine," Olivia replied, too quickly. She shot a glance at her father, now shifting from the conversation with Ray to talking to Aunt Clara, who was already 2 stories deep into her annual gossip marathon. The day unfolded in a blur of small talk and interrupted moments, the weight in Olivia's chest growing heavier with each passing minute. Finally, after the last round of pumpkin pie had been served and the plates were being cleared, Richard excused himself to his study. Olivia seized the moment. She slipped away from the dining room and followed him down the hall, her pulse thrumming with urgency. She found him at his desk, the light from the window casting deep lines across his face. Richard looked up, eyebrows lifting in surprise that quickly shifted to guarded curiosity. "Olivia? Everything all right?" he asked, setting down his reading glasses. "No, Dad. Everything's not all right," she said, shutting the door behind her. The click of the latch felt final, like a starting pistol in a race she'd avoided for too long. She took a deep breath, willing her voice to stay steady. "I found something in the attic last night. A photograph. A woman who looks exactly like Grace. And letters. Letters that talk about secrets and a child." Richard's face blanched, and for a moment, the mask he wore so carefully slipped. His hand tightened around the edge of the desk, knuckles whitening. "Olivia, you shouldn't," he started, but she cut him off. "No, you don't get to shut me down this time. I need answers, and I need them now," she said, the force of her words surprising even her. The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Richard exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He turned to the window, staring out as if gathering his thoughts from the yard below. "It was the summer after we lost Jennifer," he began, his voice hoarse and measured. "There were rumors. Whispers that she might have survived the accident. I didn't know what to believe, Olivia. I didn't want to believe it, holding on to that hope would have destroyed me, destroyed us." "But you didn't tell anyone," she pressed, the anger in her chest giving way to something raw and painful. "Not even Mom?" Richard's shoulders sagged, the weight of old grief settling back into place. "Your mother," she couldn't bear the topic. After the accident, every mention of Jennifer was like opening a wound. "But there were moments, fleeting ones, when I thought I saw her. In crowds, in passing cars. I thought I was losing my mind. And then there was that woman. She came to me, said she had information, but it was never concrete. Just hints, fragments." Olivia's heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. "The woman in the photograph," she whispered. Richard nodded, eyes clouded with the weight of memories. "Her name was Margaret. She said she had been helping a child who matched Jennifer's description. But before I could learn more, she disappeared. Letters stopped, visits were cut off. I searched, Olivia. For years. But there was nothing. Just silence." The room seemed to shrink, walls pressing inward with the revelation. "Why did you keep this from me? From all of us?" Olivia asked, her voice cracking. Richard's eyes, usually so hard and unwavering, were now rimmed with moisture. "Because hope is a cruel thing when it's unfounded. I thought it was kinder to let you grow up without the burden of what if. But now, seeing your face, I wonder if I was wrong." Emotion tightened Olivia's throat. She glanced at the papers on his desk, old contracts and neat stacks that suddenly felt trivial in comparison. "Dad, there's a waitress in town who looks exactly like Jennifer. She has the same pendant." A sharp intake of breath escaped Richard, and he turned fully to face her. His expression was a mix of disbelief and a flicker of something she hadn't seen in years, hope. "Grace," Olivia said, the name a bridge between past and present. The revelation spread through the house like wildfire, igniting a whirlwind of speculation and excitement. Olivia's voice was firm as she shared what she and Richard had discovered, and as she recounted her encounter with Grace, relatives leaned in, eyes wide, expressions flitting between astonishment and anticipation. Aunt Clara, always the most vocal, gasped and clutched her chest. She could be Jennifer? After all these years? Sam, his brows knitted in a mix of confusion and hope, muttered, "It seems impossible, but if it's true." Conversation swirled, overlapping as questions shot around the room. Uncle Ray, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. This could just be a coincidence. But even he couldn't mask the glimmer of intrigue in his eyes. The kitchen, now a hive of speculation, buzzed with energy as plates and glasses clinked amid excited chatter. The usual festive preparation for Thanksgiving had taken on an entirely different tone. Richard stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. He caught Olivia's gaze and gave her a small nod, the silent communication between them clearer than any words. It was up to her to follow this path now. The past had been buried long enough. "All right," Olivia said, raising her voice just enough to quiet the room. "I need to go back to the cafe and talk to Grace. If there's even a chance that she's connected to us, she deserves to know." "I'll go with you," Sam volunteered, eyes bright with determination. Others began to murmur offers of accompaniment, but Olivia raised her hand. "Just a few of us. We don't want to overwhelm her." In the end, Sam and Aunt Clara joined her, leaving Richard to pace the length of his study. His absence spoke volumes. Facing the possibility of a second chance was as frightening as it was thrilling. The drive to Willow's Corner felt longer this time, a tense silence filling the car. When they arrived, the cafe was quieter than it had been the day before. The lunchtime crowd had thinned, leaving a handful of regulars scattered at tables. Grace stood behind the counter, wiping down surfaces and humming a tune that sent a pang through Olivia's chest. "Grace," Olivia called, trying to keep her voice steady. The young woman turned, eyes lighting up with recognition, though her smile wavered when she saw their serious expressions. "Hey, Olivia," Grace said, glancing curiously at Sam and Clara. "Back so soon?" "Yes, and I have something I need to show you," Olivia said, stepping forward and pulling the photograph from her coat pocket. She handed it to Grace, who looked down, her eyes widening as she traced the image with her fingertips. "This is her," Grace said softly, the color draining from her face. "She's the woman who used to visit me at the orphanage. I remember she would always bring a little box of caramel candies and tell me stories. I thought I'd dreamed her up over the years." Clara exchanged a look with Sam, tears brimming in her eyes. "Grace, we think this woman might be connected to our family," Olivia said, her voice tight with emotion. "We think she might have known my sister, Jennifer." Grace's hand shook as she passed the photograph back. "I never knew her name. She would come and go, always looking over her shoulder like she was worried someone would see her." Olivia's heart raced as the puzzle pieces began to click into place. "Grace, would you come back to our home? My father, Richard, he needs to meet you." "We all do." Grace hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if it might provide answers. The quiet hum of the espresso machine, the soft murmurs of patrons, everything seemed to blur. "I don't understand. You think I'm—" Olivia stepped forward and placed a hand on Grace's arm, the gesture gentle but urgent. "We don't know anything for sure, but there are too many connections to ignore. Please, just come with us. If there's even a chance that you're part of our story, you should know." Grace's eyes shimmered with a mix of hope and fear. The years of wondering, of piecing together fragments of a past that never quite made sense, were reflected in that moment. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come." Aunt Clara exhaled, breaking the tension with a pat on Grace's back. "Good girl. You'll be with us now, and whatever we find out, we'll face it together." Sam nodded, his expression warm and reassuring. They left the cafe, the crisp air biting at their cheeks as they walked to the car. Grace's eyes darted around, the world outside the only home she'd known suddenly filled with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. She slipped into the back seat next to Aunt Clara, her fingers nervously twisting the pendant she had worn for as long as she could remember. The drive back was a mixture of silence and the occasional comforting comment from Clara. Olivia's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale as she navigated the familiar roads. Each mile seemed to stretch endlessly, the anticipation almost unbearable. Richard stood by the living room window, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow across the estate's expansive yard. When the car door slammed and footsteps echoed up the front steps, he felt a tremor run through him. The front door opened, and Olivia stepped in, followed closely by Grace. The moment Grace's eyes met Richard's, the room seemed to hold its breath. His face turned ashen, and the slight tremble in his legs became evident as he reached for the back of a chair for support. "Dad." Olivia moved quickly, placing a steadying hand on his arm. Sam stepped forward and guided him to the nearest chair, while Aunt Clara whispered a prayer under her breath, her eyes glistening. Richard sat down, eyes locked on Grace, who stood frozen in place, the warmth of the house and the multitude of expectant gazes overwhelming her. She felt a jolt deep in her chest, flashes of fragmented memories flickering like a silent movie, tiny hands holding hers, the smell of fresh-cut grass, a voice that called out her name in laughter. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as the memories ebbed and flowed, half-formed yet achingly familiar. "You look just like her," Richard finally whispered, his voice breaking. Grace's breath caught, the room blurring as the gravity of his words sunk in. He looked at her with a mix of awe, grief, and longing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all the years lost," he continued, his eyes clouded with unshed tears. "I should have tried harder. I should have done more." A hush fell over the room, the usually jovial space now charged with raw emotion. Grace moved forward, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, and knelt in front of Richard. "I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who I was or where I came from. I always wondered why I felt different." Richard reached out, his hand shaking as he touched the silver pendant that hung from Grace's neck. "This," he said, voice thick with regret, "was Jennifer's. I gave it to her when she was just a child. It was the only thing we found missing after." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence as a tear traced down his cheek. Olivia, standing close by, felt her own eyes well up, the ache of longing mixed with the bittersweet sting of hope. Grace's eyes widened as more flashes of memories broke through, running through a garden, the sound of children's laughter, and the warm, reassuring touch of a hand guiding her. Her own tears fell freely now, and she took Richard's hand in hers, holding it tightly as if to anchor them both in that moment. "I think I remember you," she whispered, the words coming out almost as a question, as if she needed confirmation. Richard nodded, his expression crumbling into relief and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I let fear stop me from searching harder. I let the pain make me blind." Sam, who had been watching with a hand on his mother's shoulder, stepped forward. "There's time now," he said softly. "Time to start again." The tension in the room eased, shifting from shock to quiet joy. The family's murmurs filled the space, soft conversations threading between the moments of silence. Aunt Clara dabbed her eyes with a napkin, then stood up straighter, a determined look on her face. "Well, we have a Thanksgiving dinner waiting. No more tears, just for tonight. We have blessings to share," she said, her voice cracking but resolute. Grace glanced up, blinking away the last of her tears. Olivia met her eyes and smiled, a tentative expression that quickly grew into one of true warmth. "Come on," she said, extending a hand to Grace. "You're home now." The dining room was aglow with candlelight, the golden glow playing off the polished silverware and crystal glasses. It was a scene steeped in tradition, but this year, it felt different, less formal, more real. Grace took a seat between Olivia and Aunt Clara, her heart thudding as the scents of sage stuffing, buttery rolls, and spiced cranberry filled the room. Richard stood at the head of the table, eyes scanning the faces around him before landing on Grace. "Before we start, I want to say something," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Tonight is more than just a Thanksgiving dinner. It's a chance to remember the past, but, more importantly, to look forward. I have regrets, many. But I also have hope that we can heal, as a family." A soft round of applause followed, not the usual formal clapping, but the kind born from shared understanding. Plates were passed, stories were told, and laughter bubbled up between bites. Clara recounted childhood pranks, making Sam groan as the table erupted into giggles. Even Richard joined in, a rare smile breaking across his face as he listened, the weight on his heart lifting. Grace found herself laughing, too, the sound surprising her as it left her lips. It felt as if she were reclaiming a piece of herself that had been missing for too long. She turned to Olivia, who was watching her with a mixture of joy and relief. "Thank you," Grace said softly, the words encompassing so much more than gratitude for an invitation. They were for the chance to belong, to fill a space she hadn't known was empty until now. Olivia squeezed her hand under the table. "We're just getting started," she replied, eyes glistening. And as the meal went on, with glasses raised and toasts and stories shared well into the evening, the house, once marked by the echoes of loss, resonated with the warmth of reunion and the promise of new beginnings. The following weeks passed in a flurry of anticipation and quiet hope. The DNA test felt like a formality now, a way to solidify the truth that the entire family felt in their bones. Grace stayed at the Hart estate, becoming a part of the household in a way that felt both strange and achingly natural. The mornings were filled with shared cups of coffee at the kitchen island, laughter drifting in as Olivia and Sam recounted childhood antics. Richard found himself wandering into rooms where Grace sat, not saying much, but absorbing her presence as if afraid she might disappear if he blinked. Finally, the day came when the DNA results arrived. The family gathered in the living room, the sealed envelope resting on the coffee table like a fragile promise. Richard's hand hovered over it, and then he looked up, eyes meeting Olivia's before shifting to Grace, who stood beside her, fingers knotted together. "Would you like to do the honors?" he asked softly. Grace hesitated for only a moment before nodding. With trembling hands, she picked up the envelope, the paper crinkling as she tore it open. The room held its breath as she unfolded the letter and read. Her eyes filled with tears, and a small, choked sound escaped her throat. "It's true," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm Jennifer." A collective gasp swept the room. Clara reached for a handkerchief, sobbing openly as Sam pulled her into a hug. Richard's eyes closed, a tear slipping down his cheek as the weight of decades fell away. He reached out for Grace, who stepped into his embrace, and for the first time in years, the house was filled with something other than longing, it was filled with joy. Olivia stood back for a moment, watching as her father and sister clung to each other, overwhelmed. She felt a warmth spread through her, deeper than anything she had known. Grace caught her eye and reached out, pulling Olivia into their embrace. They stayed like that, tangled together, bound not just by blood but by the silent promise of second chances. The following days were a whirlwind of celebration. The news spread among the extended family, who visited with gifts, flowers, and tears. Grace, still navigating her new reality, found comfort in Olivia's steady presence. They spent long nights in the library, wrapped in blankets, recounting childhood stories and imagining what could have been. They discovered shared quirks, an aversion to pickles, a love of classic films, and the bond between them grew quickly, as if making up for lost time. Richard, too, was transformed. The stern lines of his face softened, and he began to speak of the past with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "I let fear guide me," he said one evening, voice husky with regret. "But I promise you, Jennifer, Grace, I'll make up for it now." Grace nodded, tears in her eyes, but they were tears of healing, not loss. One afternoon, as they sat on the back patio, Grace looked at Olivia, an idea sparking in her eyes. "I'd like to invite my adoptive parents here for Christmas," she said. "They raised me, loved me. They deserve to know this new part of my life, and I want them to meet all of you." Olivia's heart warmed at the suggestion. "I think that's perfect," she said, glancing at Richard, who nodded with a small smile. The preparations for Christmas took on a new meaning that year. The estate, already grand in its holiday decor, seemed brighter with the energy of a family renewed. Wreaths adorned the doors, and twinkling lights glistened along the banisters. The kitchen was alive with the sounds of baking cookies and good-natured bickering between Sam and Aunt Clara over the perfect pie crust. Grace fit seamlessly into it all, helping string cranberries for the tree and singing along to carols that Olivia played on the piano. On Christmas Eve, Grace's adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, arrived. They stepped into the grand entryway, eyes wide with awe and nervous smiles etched on their faces. Richard approached them, extending a hand with genuine warmth. "Thank you for taking care of my daughter," he said, voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Turner, a petite woman with kind eyes, clasped his hand and nodded, her own eyes brimming. "We loved her like our own," Mr. Turner said. "We never imagined something like this." The evening unfolded with laughter, shared memories, and the blending of two worlds. Stories were swapped about Grace's childhood, punctuated with moments that made everyone laugh until their sides hurt. Richard watched it all, the once solemn halls of the estate now filled with noise and life. He caught Olivia's eye, and she gave him a nod that spoke of understanding and forgiveness. As the night drew on, Olivia sat by the fire with Grace beside her. The room glowed with warmth, the soft flicker of flames casting golden light on the faces around them. Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, listening to the sound of his family, whole and happy. "It feels like a dream," Grace whispered, leaning her head against Olivia's shoulder. "It's real," Olivia said, squeezing her hand. "And it's just the beginning." The laughter, the clinking glasses, and the soft strains of carols filled the room. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the estate in a blanket of white. Inside, hearts were full, and the promise of a future woven together, one rich with shared memories, love, and the unyielding bonds of family, took root.